Hey, and welcome back to another video. So the iPod Touch 7 Gen is a device first released in 2019 and is better known for being the last iPod ever released, as it was discontinued on May 10th of 2022, bringing an end to the iPod lineup as a whole, which lasted a little over 20 years, starting on October 23rd, 2001 with the release of the iPod Classic Gen 1. And today in this video, we will take a look at what it's like using the iPod Touch 7th generation here in 2022. I have been using this device for a little over 2 months at this point, and will give you my full experience with it and how it holds up today. This is using the last ever iPod in 2022. So as usual, before jumping right in, don't forget to smash that like button down below, as it helps this video get on YouTube's algorithm. And also don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below and ring that bell notification button so you're notified whenever I upload a new video. Also don't forget to leave a comment down below and let me know what you think about this video or the iPod Touch 7th generation. Do you own one? Do you plan on getting one in the future? Or anything else you'd like to let me know down in the comment section below. If you have any questions as well, don't forget to ask those questions down below so I can answer your questions. My social media is linked down in the description below, which includes Instagram, Discord, and Twitter. And now let's jump right into this video. So starting off with a bit of history on the iPod Touch 7th generation, it was launched on May 28th of 2019 and it launched with iOS 12.3. And apart from that, it was just another iPod Touch. That's basically all that is. It's extremely identical to the 6th generation. The camera is identical, the dimensions, everything. The only major difference between the 6th and 7th generation were the colors. And furthermore, they were exactly the same, almost exactly the same as the 5th generation. The only main difference is the 5th generation had that small pop-up ring-like thing for the iPod loop thing that Apple did, the lanyard strap that was a failure. And apart from that, this thing and the 6th gen have a almost, 10-year-old design starting from 2012. So it is definitely out of date in terms of design. And this thing did not sell well at all. It was just that thing, that niche thing that some people still wanted to buy, maybe for their kids or if they just wanted to get away from their phones. It wasn't something that sold like hotcakes, unlike back in the day, for example, with the iPod Touch 3rd generation and the 4th generation, which sold really well. The 5th generation's design has still lasted that long because Apple did not want to put too much effort into designing something that is dying over time. And eventually, as of May 10th, 2022, Apple decided, you know what, let's axe the iPod entirely. No one's really buying these things anymore. And once they told everyone that they're canceling it, then the 7th generation actually started selling really well. The last ones in stock started selling really well, including this one, which I also bought on around May 10th, as I believe, or a few days later, I can't remember. And if I bring it closer, as you can see, I have engraved mine as well. So 10/23/2001, which is basically October 23rd, 2001 is when the first ever iPod was released, the iPod Classic 1st generation, like that one over there, to the 10th of May 2022 when it was finally cancelled. 20 years of fun, which was a bit over 20 years since these two dates. It's just slightly over 20 years apart. So everyone got identical engravings on their final iPods as well. So this thing did sell quite well in its last few days. The last remaining one sold like hotcakes because everyone wanted to get their hands on the last ever iPod. And apart from that, that's all I can say about the history of the iPod Touch 7th generation. It wasn't a sparkly device. Apple really didn't put too much effort into designing this thing and putting any new technology into it because they knew it wasn't going to sell well, and they probably knew that down the line they're going to have to cancel the iPod lineup as a whole anyway. So they didn't really put too much thought into designing this. They stuck with the 5th generation's basic design and just release it for parents who just want to get their kids something to mess with, or the niche market of people that just want to stay away from their phones and use something else. But apart from that, that's all that I can say about the iPod Touch 7th generation and its history. It was just a simple device with not much thought put into it, just a very basic device for a very niche market, and eventually it ended up being the final iPod ever released. Now, in terms of design and build quality, like I just said a few seconds ago, this thing shares exactly the same design characteristics as the 6th generation and 5th generation. The only differences being the color, and the 5th gen having that small button-like thing here for the lanyard. Apart from that, it looks exactly identical to the 5th and 6th generation and shares some of the tech specs of the 6th and 5th generation as well, which we'll get into in a bit. Up front, we have the front-facing camera over there, and we have the single home button, which did not eventually get Touch ID, like some people were suspecting that the 8th generation, if it ever released, would have had Touch ID, but that never happened. And that's of course all for the front of the device. So moving on to the bottom of the device, as you can see, we have our 3.5mm headphone jack over here. We have our lightning connector over here and our single bottom firing mono speaker over there. We have nothing on this side. At the top of the device, we have our sleep wake / power button over there. On this side, we have our volume rockers up and down, and that's about it. Moving on to the back of the device, we have our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth antenna over here. We have a single LED flash, the rear firing microphone or rear facing microphone, the 8-megapixel camera. Your engraving goes over here. This is my engraving like I showed you earlier. iPod branding with the Apple logo, and your serial number over there, which I have covered up. So apart from all that, it, like I said, it shares everything identical to the 6th generation and 5th generation, just a few minor differences. Of course, it being an Apple device, Apple did not skimp out on the design and build quality itself. The buttons feel great in the hand. It feels great in the hand as well. It's really slim at about, I think, 7.9 millimeters. I'll put it up here if I was wrong exactly what that was, the thickness of the device. So I think it's about 7.9 millimeters. So it's really thin and it feels great in the hand. It's built of glass and aluminum, feels really premium, just like any other Apple device. So they did not skimp out on that. But then again, it still reminds me of my 5th generation iPod Touch because it shares all the same design characteristics and a lot of technical specifications as well from the 6th gen. So it does remind me of my 5th gen when I was using this throughout the last 2.5 months-ish. It, of course, brought back a lot of memories from using my 5th gen in 2012 to 2014. I don't have that device with me right now. It's back home, but eventually I'll feature it on this channel. It was also a identical color. It was the gray version with the black front, so same color. The only difference is my 5th gen, I had the lanyard strap or the iPod loop, and I actually used that thing. I kind of liked it. So I was one of those people that actually liked the loop. Apart from that, it feels exactly the same as my 5th gen. Nothing new, nothing surprising, nothing sparkly. The only minor differences, like I mentioned, it had sleep to wake and it had raise to wake. The 5th gen did not have raise to wake. This thing has a raise to wake functionality, as you can see there. But apart from that, like I mentioned, it's almost identical to my iPod Touch 5th generation. Brought back a lot of memories from those days in 2012. Another thing it shares from the 6th and 5th generation is the resolution and size of its display. So it's a 4-inch display with Apple's strange resolution. So the resolution on this thing is 1136. So 1136 vertically by 640 horizontally. So 640 by 1136 or 1136 by 640, which means it's a 640p display because you count the lower number as the value there. So 920 by 1080, which is 1080p, you call it 1080p, not 920p, because you take the lower value. And this thing has a pixel density of about 326 pixels per inch, the same pixel density from the iPhone 4 from 2010. But for what it is, it gets the job done, honestly. It's a basic display that shares the same pixel density as the iPhone 4, but it gets the job done. It's bright, the colors are accurate, they're sharp, and they're really nice to look at. Let me show you max brightness over there. So it's really bright, and it was a summer, it is still summer, of course. Today's a bit gloomy, but it was summer, more bright summer conditions out just a few days ago and a month ago when I was using this thing. So I took it out in bright sunny conditions, and this display performed amazingly in bright sunny conditions. No problem with the brightness over there. And I just, again, remind me of my 5th generation's display. And if you've used a 6th gen or a 5th gen, you're not going to notice too much of a difference unless you start looking and comparing the colors side by side. Of course, Apple did make some differences, some changes. They improved it a bit more from the 5th and 6th gen. But apart from that, if you're just looking at it from the surface, it's not going to look too different. So the display, yeah, it was just a nice experience actually going back to a 4-inch display all the way from an iPhone 12 Pro Max's display, because I used this iPhone 12 Pro Max on the daily. Using the smaller device on the smaller display was somewhat of a throwback to older devices, but then again, it's nothing that I haven't seen before. It's just reminiscent of my 5th generation. Again, I keep referencing that it's because they share so much in common. But yeah, that was the display. Overall, a pretty decent display, perfectly usable here in 2022 if you don't mind the smaller size and the slightly lower resolution. But then again, you won't notice that too badly. Now, in terms of internal specifications, this thing being an iPod Touch was no powerhouse. It was relatively powerful for what it is and what applications it need run. However, it is not a powerhouse by any definition of the word. It came in a bunch of colors, of course, product red, space gray like this one, gold, silver, pink, and blue. And it came in 3 capacities as well, 32 gigs, 128 gigs, and 256 gigs as well, priced accordingly as $199 for the 32 gig model, $299 for the 128 gig model, and $399 for the 256 gig model. And this particular one is a 32 gig model because I didn't want to go for the higher end models just for a memorable device or a basically a last iPod just for show purposes and just for display purposes, because I don't see myself using this quite a lot in the future as it gets older. In terms of processors, this thing has an Apple A10 Fusion processor along with the M10 Motion Coprocessor, essentially the same stuff that's inside the iPhone 7. However, this thing's Apple A10 is actually a dual core down from a quad core on the iPhone 7, which sort of makes it a completely different processor. I don't know why they still call it the A10, because when you take 2 entire cores out of a quad core and make it a dual core, you change the processor significantly, but they still call it the Apple A10 processor. And it's also only 1.64 gigahertz, down from 2.34 gigahertz on the iPhone 7's Apple A10 processor. So a toned down iPhone 7 essentially is what this thing is. It also has 2 gigs of LPDDR4 RAM for its basic multitasking purposes, I guess, and it does get the job done quite well. You can run a bunch of apps in the background, no problem. Not too many. You may have to reload some maps, and I'll show that in the OS experience part of this video. However, it still can run quite a bit of apps in the background with the LPDDR2 RAM. Again, it's an iOS device. You don't need too much RAM. Apple does vertical integration really well, so you don't really need that much RAM to run stuff in the background. However, there's also a limit that 2 gigs can do. But it does not show too badly on a day-to-day user basis, because this is an iPod, this is not a phone. You'll be not running too many things. You'll be not doing Word documents and Googling stuff at the same time, plus all that stuff. You'll be just playing games and checking social media on this thing, maybe watching a YouTube video then and there. And for a quick fun fact about the iPod Touch 7 generation, it is the first and of course last iPod to ever have the battery percentage up on the right upper corner next to the battery indicator over here. Because if you remember, not a single iPod in the past ever had a battery percentage monitor in terms of showing you exactly the correct precise amount of battery you have. Instead of these small bars within the battery indicator over there, the bars drop over time and show you segments of the battery as it drops or it increases while you charge it. So this is the first and the last to actually show you the battery percentage on the home screen, which is quite interesting to know. But yeah, apart from that, that is the internal specs of this thing. Nothing too spectacular, but then again, it is an iPod. They were never powerhouses to begin with. So we are here in the interface, as you can see here, and this thing is currently running iOS 15.6, and iOS 15 is the last version of iOS that this thing will get. Controversially, the 5th generation iPad, or iPad Air 5th generation, or iPad 5th generation, whatever you want to call it, that thing has the lesser Apple A9 processor, while this thing has the A10 Fusion. However, the 5th generation iPad is getting iPad OS 16 or iOS 16. It's called iPad OS 16 now, but you get the point that something with a less power processor is getting a higher OS than this, and that may have to do with the older ones, the older iPod Touch 7 generations, not doing battery as well as an iPad, because a bigger iPad battery does degrade slower when compared to a smaller iPod battery like this. This thing's battery is considerably smaller than an iPad's battery, of course, and we'll talk about the battery later. So that may be one of the reasons as to why this thing cannot handle iOS 16, so they let it stick with iOS 15. But regardless, that is the max operating system this thing will run, which is iOS 15.6, which is running now. It'll probably get a few more updates in the future. Of course, it's not going to be stuck with 15.6. However, all the updates coming after now will be iterations of iOS 15 in the form of security updates for probably another 2 years time, or maybe even 3 years, depending on how many people are still using this thing. Apple will give out updates. But regardless, that is the update situation on the iPod Touch 7th generation. The interface as a whole functions just fine on iOS 15. It is a bit stuttery at times. Of course, you can expect that from such an old device running a newer operating system, and that's kind of why they probably didn't want to give it iOS 16 as well, because it would handle it a bit worse. But everything else works just fine. Multitasking works fine. Notification center, then your quick settings, everything opens up just fine. Multitasking is also fine on the 2 gigs of RAM. All apps open relatively fast, so let's open some apps here. So Instagram, there we go, that's Instagram. And then YouTube Studio over there. As you can see, things open really fast. So if you're using this for day-to-day basic tasks, you're not going to have any problem at all running all of that. So that is the music app. We can open Safari, we can open Apple's website over there. You can see the website loads relatively fast, and everything loads fine as well. All the images, all the text and the animations, because Apple's website is a bit hard to load for older devices, but as you can see, it loads just fine. Sadly, there's no iPod section anymore over here, but that wasn't anyway for quite a while. You had to go to music and then go to iPod from there, so it was getting buried over time. But as you can see, Apple's website opens there just fine, so that's also nice to see. And then multitasking also works just fine. Just don't expect to open too many tabs in the background. The 2 gigs of RAM does have its limits. Regardless, it still works just fine. It'll open your apps relatively fine, reopen them. If they have to be reopened, they will be reopened, but apart from that, it opens just fine. The performance is pretty decent. You can play music in the background and all that stuff while doing other things. You can multitask perfectly fine. I can imagine over time, as the internet gets a bit more complicated and apps get more newer, this thing will slow down and not be able to run all the apps. Of course, that happens, but that will take about at least 3 to 4 years. So you can expect to use this device for about 3 to 4 more years until apps start becoming unbearable to use, and eventually they stop supporting iOS 15 as a whole. But as far as now goes, it is a perfectly usable device that I've been using for the last 2 months. It works just fine. One of the main selling points of the iPod Touch was its ability to play games just like the iPhone, and that was one of the main things that sold the iPod Touch to parents who just wanted their kids to not have a phone and just play games on an identical device. And the iPod Touch 7th generation is no different. So I will test some games here, and the games I've selected are Asphalt 9, which is a heavier game, a bit harder to run, and Road Trip 2, which is a much older game that I've played multiple times over the course of many years, and it's a simple 2D game. So a lot of people do like playing simple games, but there are people who like to play heavier games as well, like Asphalt 9, PUBG, Call of Duty. So this will be a good test for heavier games, and Road Trip 2 will be a good test for lighter games. So we'll start off with Road Trip 2 and then go to Asphalt 9. Alright, now on to Asphalt 9. Now I have to point out that sometimes the loading screens on this are quite long, up to even 2 minutes I've noticed, but it's random. Sometimes they're fast, sometimes they're long. And if you keep only this running in the background without having anything else running in the background, it will run a bit faster, of course, because there's more RAM to work with. And also it does get a bit warm, not considerably warm, but somewhat warm, because I've been playing a few games now and it has got somewhat warm, but it's no different from any other Apple device. It gets relatively warm. It's not extreme, but it is somewhat warm, just so you know. There's a bit of stutter here and there, but it's not too bad, but it can sometimes happen. But I've noticed that in Asphalt 8 and Asphalt 7 as well on other devices. Asphalt does have a few stuttering issues as per the game. But let's get to some gameplay on Asphalt 9 here. So as you saw there, it does have some stuttering issues. Again, it's very random. Sometimes it runs really well, sometimes it runs with a considerable amount of stutter. So Asphalt 9 may be somewhat getting to the limit of the capabilities of this device, but I'm pretty sure Call of Duty and other games like that, PUBG, will also run similarly. But again, it's quite random and there's no real pattern to when the stutter is going to occur. But 2D games like Road Trip 2 and all the other games on the App Store which are in the 2D format will run just fine as long as they're supported. It's just the 3D games which are a bit heavier which will have trouble running on this device if they're even more heavier than Asphalt 9 as well. And they will be the games that will be losing support earlier than the 2D games. 2D games will run probably for at least another 5 years support on iOS 15. It's the 3D stuff that may go away within 2 to 3 years, right after security updates stop coming for this thing. So just keep that in mind. But 2D games are good for quite a while. Now, the camera on this thing, to put it simply, is basic. Actually, a lot of review websites called the camera quite underwhelming and compared it to the 2016 iPhone SE's camera, aka the first generation iPhone SE. So comparing that, it's a device that's 3 years older, because this was launched in 2019 and the iPhone SE Gen 1 was launched in 2016. That's not a good look when you compare it to such an old phone even at the time. Regardless, the camera on the iPod Touch 7th generation is an 8 megapixel shooter with an f2.4 aperture and can record video at 1080p at 30 fps. And here's a fun fact. On Apple's website, it says that it could do video recording at 1080p at 25 fps, 30 fps, or 60 fps. However, as you can see here, there's no option for 25 fps or 60 fps. The only option is 720p 30 fps and 1080p 30 fps, which is quite strange, to be honest, because Apple's website usually doesn't get things wrong. Regardless, it may be just a small oversight. It also can record video at slow motion at 120 fps as well. The front-facing camera, again, a pretty basic camera. It's a 1.2 megapixel shooter with an f2.2 aperture and can record video at 720p at 30 fps as well. And like I mentioned already, the camera is pretty basic, again, compared to a iPhone SE Gen 1 camera. Nothing too surprising, nothing too sparkly. I did go out today and take some photos with it, so you guys can actually look at these photos and be the judge yourself. I'm leaning towards it not being too crappy as compared to an iPhone SE first generation. I think the photos are somewhat better, but then again, it could be subjective as well, and a lot of people did agree that it did look a lot like the iPhone SE first generation's camera. So again, you be the judge yourself after you've seen these photos and video samples as well. So let's roll the photo samples and video samples, and I'll also put in a slow motion video sample as well at 120 fps. So let's roll the photos in 3, 2, 1. So as you saw with those photo and video samples, this thing actually takes some really nice photos. They're sharp, they're bright, they're not overly saturated, the colors are accurate, and everything looks really nice. As far as the photos and videos go, it's just they're a bit similar to the iPod Touch 6th generation's camera and the iPhone SE 1st generation. Regardless, it still takes some really nice photo and video. Now we're getting to what may be the worst aspect of the iPod Touch 7th generation, which is its battery life. Now, if you look at older reviews from 2019, you'll see that a lot of the larger websites have also said the battery life is not horrible, but it's not great either. And here in 2022, with all the new updates to iOS 15.6 and stuff, the battery life is not, up there. It will get you throughout one day on medium use, but if you're heavy using this thing, for example, playing a lot of games and all that stuff, expect the battery life to last about half a day. Honestly, if you're playing games like Asphalt 9, this thing will probably last 1.5 hours if you're just running Asphalt 9 alone. So if that's what you want to play, if you just want to focus on games alone, like heavy games like Asphalt 9, you probably should get an iPad instead, because this thing's battery will last about 1.5 hours on very heavy use like gaming. Heavy use, maybe half a day. Medium use, 1 full day. And if you're super light using it just for music and stuff, maybe 2 to 3 days. That's also possible. Now, this thing's battery is a 1043 milliamp hour battery, so it's a very low capacity battery. Just 1043. There are old Nokias from 2005 with bigger batteries than this thing, and this thing's battery capacity is rated at 40 hours music playback and 8 hours of video playback. And for music and video, I think that's still quite correct, because this one is a new one, by the way. I unboxed this thing and I started using it brand new, so the battery is still probably a 100% health. And music and video playback is probably still 40 hours and 8 hours, but everything else, running heavier apps and stuff, this thing's battery will start tanking. So yeah, if battery life is your thing for heavier gaming and all that stuff, definitely consider getting an iPad or an iPhone, because this thing's battery will not please you. But if for basic simple use, music and the occasional 2D game, maybe watching some videos, YouTube videos, etc., maybe you want to take this to the gym with your Bluetooth headphones, sure, go right ahead. The battery is more than sufficient. It's just not going to hold up for heavier use. So as a final conclusion, should you get an iPod Touch 7th generation? Now, the main issue that's gonna be out here is the pricing. Now, since people have figured out that this thing is now a collector's item, prices have gone out of proportion. I saw the same thing, this thing, the 32 gig model, brand new in box for like $500 that day, and I was like, yeah, people have really started to scalp these things. So getting one brand new is not going to look that tempting because of the prices, but you could get a used one for relatively cheap, maybe $60 to $80 I've seen, with a few cracks, but in really good condition, maybe about $120 ish. They'll drop over time, but the new ones are going to be really expensive because of the collector's state, and eventually the old ones will eventually go back to really high prices as well. For example, a good comparison is the Nokia 808 PureView. This thing for some time dropped to around $90 just about 5 to 6 years ago, and now these things go for $300, $400. I paid $200 for this one just about 2.5 years ago. So things go down in price, but once they start hitting a collector's item, or like people start buying them quite a lot to add to their collection, people realize, oh, those are collector's item, and prices go up drastically. So that's going to definitely happen to this thing as well, because a lot of iPods are collector's items. For example, the 5th generation U2 iPod Classic over there, that one is also a collector's item and sells for really high prices. But if you want to get one for basic use, yeah, just look into it. But then again, you can get a used iPhone with which you don't have to put the SIM in for cheaper than that. You can get like an iPhone 7 for about $80 if you look carefully, or even cheaper. So, and you get a better camera, you'll get a lot of other stuff that are considerably better than this. So yeah, unless you really want an iPod, I really cannot recommend this. There are iPhones for much cheaper as well. If you really look carefully, you can get really good deals on iPhones, just with a few cracks, and maybe needs a battery replacement, but they'll still be considerably cheaper, which is why another reason that iPods failed, because used iPhones are also just even better, and they're cheaper. So that's another thing. But yeah, if you still want to get one for your collection, then it's a different story. But for usage, I really can't recommend it unless you get it for ultra cheap. But yeah, this was using the iPod Touch 7th generation in 2022. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will definitely use this iPod since I paid full price for this thing for as long as I can use it. I'll use it for music, I'll use it for workouts, and eventually once it's no longer that usable, I'll put it into my collection and that's where it'll sit for the rest of its life. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you honestly did, don't forget to smash that like button down below as it helps this video get on YouTube's algorithm, and also don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below and ring that bell notification button so you're notified whenever I upload a new video. Also, don't forget to leave a question down below or leave a comment down below and let me know what you think about the iPod Touch 7th generation. Do you have one? Do you plan on getting one? Did you own one at some point? Or if you have any questions, leave a question down below. I can answer your questions or we can start a discussion. My social media is linked down in the description below, which includes Instagram, Discord, and Twitter. Thumbs up, and I'll see you guys in my next video.